In 1884, 14 men gathered in a room in Berlin. None of them were African. None of them had ever set foot in most of the places they were about to divide. Yet in just 3 months, with nothing but maps and pens, they would redraw an entire continent, splitting families, kingdoms, and cultures that had existed for thousands of years. This is the story of how Africa was carved up like a birthday cake, and how its people fought back in ways the world never expected. But to understand what was stolen, you first need to see what was there. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was already discovering itself and teaching the world. In the 1600s, while Europe was still recovering from plagues and wars, the Kingdom of Congo was sending ambassadors to meet the Pope in Rome. These weren't primitive tribes, these were sophisticated diplomats wearing tailored robes, carrying gifts, and speaking multiple languages. One ambassador, Dom Emmanuel, traveled across the Atlantic, through Spain, and into the heart of the Catholic world. He died just 2 days after arriving in Rome, but his journey proved something powerful. Africa was already connected to the world. At the same time, in the city of Timbuktu, something extraordinary was happening. While most European cities had libraries you could count on one hand, Timbuktu had over 1 million manuscripts, books on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. Scholars debated philosophy under the stars. Students memorized entire texts without ever writing them down. This wasn't a backwater, this was a university town that would make Oxford jealous. Travel east, and you'd find the Swahili coast, a string of trading cities connecting Africa to Arabia, India, and China. Dhows with triangular sails carried ivory, gold, and glass beads across the Indian Ocean. African sailors navigated using stars and seasonal winds, just as skillfully as any European captain. The port of Kilwa was so wealthy that its buildings were constructed from coral stone and adorned with Chinese porcelain. And in southern Africa stood Great Zimbabwe, a stone city built without mortar, its walls fitting together so perfectly that not even a blade could slip between them. No slaves built this. No foreign architects designed it. This was African engineering at its finest. The point is simple. Africa was never empty. It was never silent. It was never waiting. It was thriving. Let me introduce you to some names you should know. Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, who became so famous that his pilgrimage to Mecca is still talked about today. In 1324, he set off with 60,000 people, 80 camels carrying gold, and a generosity so legendary that he gave away so much gold in Egypt that he crashed their economy for a decade. Imagine being so rich that your kindness causes inflation. His empire controlled the gold and salt trade routes that connected North and West Africa. Salt was as valuable as gold back then. It preserved food, seasoned meals, and was essential for survival in the desert. Traders would exchange gold dust for slabs of salt, ounce for ounce. Mansa Musa didn't just rule with wealth, he ruled with wisdom, building mosques, libraries, and universities across his empire. Then there's Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. While Europe was still learning to read, Ethiopian monks were carving entire churches out of solid rock. King Lalibela commissioned 11 churches hewn from the mountains, cathedrals that still stand today. Their walls cool and quiet, their altars carved from the earth itself. Pilgrims walked barefoot for days just to pray there. Ethiopia never fell to colonizers. Remember that. When Italy tried to invade in 1896, Ethiopia didn't just resist, it crushed them. Over 100,000 Ethiopians, led by Emperor Menelik II, defeated 15,000 Italian soldiers at the Battle of Adwa. It was a humiliation so complete that Italy wouldn't try again for 40 years. And down south, the Zulu kingdom was rising under the leadership of Shaka Zulu. He didn't just build an army, he revolutionized warfare. Short stabbing spears for close combat, shield formations that moved like waves, discipline so fierce that his warriors could march 50 miles in a day without breaking formation. The Zulu didn't wait for threats to come, they met them head on. These weren't legends, these were real people, real kingdoms, real power. And Europe was watching. The Portuguese arrived first in the 1500s, not as conquerors, but as traders. They set up small posts along the coast, trading cloth and wine for gold and ivory. At first, African kings welcomed them. Trade was good, ideas were exchanged. Some African rulers even converted to Christianity, not because they were forced, but because they were curious. But then the Dutch came, then the English, then the French, and slowly, the nature of trade began to change. Europeans weren't just interested in gold anymore. They wanted something far more terrible: people. The transatlantic slave trade didn't start overnight. It grew like a shadow, quiet at first, then all-consuming. African kingdoms were torn apart as neighbors turned on neighbors, capturing people to sell to European traders. Some kingdoms resisted. Others participated, believing they had no choice, and millions of Africans were dragged onto ships and sent across the Atlantic, never to see their homes again. But here's what they don't tell you in school. Africans fought back. Some kingdoms, like Benin and Congo, tried to limit or even ban the slave trade. Leaders sent letters to European kings begging them to stop. Some refused to cooperate entirely. And the enslaved, those who survived the journey, carried their culture with them. They brought their music, their food, their stories, their resistance. Even in chains, they didn't forget who they were. If you have kids or teach children, I've also written a kid-friendly version of this story designed for screen-free learning. You'll find the link in the description. By the 1800s, the world began to wake up. The slave trade was officially abolished by Britain in 1807, then by other nations over the following decades. But the damage was done. Entire regions were depopulated. Economies collapsed. Trust was shattered. And Europe was just getting started. The 1800s brought a new kind of power. Machines. Factories roared to life in Britain, France, and Germany. Steam engines replaced horses. Iron ships replaced wooden ones. And suddenly, Europe needed more coal, more rubber, more cotton, more oil. The Industrial Revolution turned nations into hungry giants, and Africa had what they wanted. But this time, they weren't interested in trading. They wanted control. Explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley mapped Africa's rivers, the Nile, the Congo, the Zambezi, not out of curiosity, but to prepare the way for colonization. These weren't innocent adventures. Every map drawn was a blueprint for invasion. Every river charted was a highway for exploitation. Stanley, in particular, was a master manipulator. While claiming to bring civilization to Africa, he worked for King Leopold II of Belgium, one of the cruelest colonial rulers in history. Leopold wanted the Congo not for its people, but for its rubber, and he was willing to do anything to get it. But we'll come back to that nightmare later. Now, we return to that room in Berlin. 1884. 14 nations gathered. Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and the United States. Not a single African leader was invited. For 3 months, these men argued, negotiated, and drew lines on maps. They decided that any European nation could claim African land if they could prove they controlled it. This meant sending soldiers, building forts, and forcing Africans to accept foreign rule. They called it the Scramble for Africa. Africa called it theft. Rivers became borders, mountains were divided, families were split. The Maasai people woke up one day to find themselves living in 2 different countries, Kenya and Tanzania, even though they'd been one people for centuries. The Yoruba were divided between Nigeria and Benin. The Somali were split into 5 different territories. And it wasn't just borders. Languages were imposed, names were erased, religions were banned. Children were forced into European schools where they were taught that their own cultures were primitive and savage. But here's the twist. Africa didn't go quietly. While Europe celebrated its new empires, Africa was preparing to fight. In 1879, the British invaded Zululand, confident they would crush the savages within days. At the Battle of Isandlwana, over 20,000 Zulu warriors surrounded and annihilated a British force of 1,800 men. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history. The British eventually won the war through sheer numbers and superior weapons. But the Zulu had made their point. Africa would not surrender without a fight. In West Africa, Samori Touré built an empire and held off the French for 16 years. He modernized his army, bought weapons from the British, and used guerrilla tactics to frustrate European forces. When the French finally captured him in 1898, they had to send 4 expeditions and thousands of soldiers to do it. And in Algeria, resistance lasted over a century. The French tried to crush Algerian identity, banning Arabic, seizing land, and settling French colonists. But the Algerians never stopped fighting. It would take until 1962 before Algeria finally won its independence. But the most stunning resistance came from Ethiopia. 1896. Italy, flush with imperial ambition, decided it was time to add Ethiopia to its growing African empire. They sent 15,000 soldiers, armed with the latest rifles and artillery. Emperor Menelik II received the news calmly. He sent out a call to arms. Over 100,000 Ethiopians answered: farmers, priests, women, children. They came from every corner of the empire, carrying spears, swords, and whatever rifles they could find. Russia, recognizing a fellow Orthodox Christian nation, secretly sent weapons. On March 1st, 1896, the two armies met at Adwa. The Italians were confident. They outnumbered the Ethiopians in firepower and believed European military superiority was a given. They were wrong. The Ethiopian forces surrounded the Italians on three sides. They used the terrain, mountains, valleys, and forests to their advantage. They attacked in waves, coordinated by drummers and horn players. The Italians broke and ran. By the end of the day, 6,000 Italians were dead and 3,000 were captured. Europe was stunned. For the first time, an African army had decisively defeated a European power. Ethiopia remained independent, the only African nation to do so during the scramble. Menelik sent a message to the world. Africa could defend itself. Let's talk about what colonialism actually looked like. In the Belgian Congo, King Leopold II turned an entire country into his personal rubber plantation. He didn't even pretend it was about civilization. He wanted profit, and he got it by cutting off the hands of workers who didn't meet their quotas. Villages that resisted were burned. Families were held hostage to force men to work. Millions died from murder, starvation, and disease. Leopold's agents kept baskets of severed hands as proof they'd punished lazy workers. When the world finally learned what was happening, the international outcry forced Belgium to take the Congo from Leopold in 1908. But the damage was done. In German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, the Herero and Nama people rebelled against German settlers who had stolen their land and cattle. The German response? Genocide. General Lothar von Trotha ordered his soldiers to drive the Herero into the desert and shoot anyone who tried to return. 80% of the Herero people were killed. Survivors were thrown into concentration camps where doctors performed experiments on them. One of those doctors, Eugen Fischer, later taught Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor who experimented on Jews during the Holocaust. The connection is direct. Colonial genocide was the laboratory for Nazi atrocities. In French West Africa, forced labor built railways and roads. Men were conscripted, taken from their families, and worked to death in brutal conditions. The French called it development. Africans called it slavery, with a new name. And in British colonies, land was seized and given to white settlers. In Kenya, the White Highlands became exclusive zones where Africans weren't allowed to own land, even though they'd lived there for generations. In South Africa, the seeds of apartheid were planted, a system that would legally separate races and brutalize black Africans for nearly a century. But here's the thing about culture. You can ban it, burn it, and beat it out of people, but you can't kill it. Africans found ways to resist quietly. They sang forbidden songs in coded language. They told stories to their children in secret. They preserved traditional dances and passed them off as entertainment for colonial masters, hiding sacred meanings in plain sight. In West Africa, griots traditional storytellers memorized entire genealogies and histories, keeping them alive when colonial schools refused to teach them. In East Africa, Swahili became a language of resistance, blending African and Arab influences into something uniquely powerful, and religion became a battleground. Missionaries built churches and schools, teaching Africans to read, but also teaching them that their ancestors were heathens. Some Africans converted genuinely. Others pretended, practicing traditional beliefs in private. And some brilliant thinkers found ways to blend Christianity with African spirituality, creating new traditions that honored both. Education was complicated. On one hand, colonial schools gave Africans tools, literacy, mathematics, science that they would later use to fight for independence. On the other hand, those same schools taught them to be ashamed of who they were. Students learned European history, but nothing about their own empires. They read Shakespeare, but not their own poets. Still, some found ways to turn colonial tools against their oppressors. Young Africans educated in European universities came home with ideas about freedom, equality, and self-determination. They read the same books Europeans did about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the rights of man, and they asked, if these ideas are universal, why don't they apply to us? By the way, if you're watching this with young people, or if you teach children, I want you to know that I've also written a kid-friendly version of this story, designed for screen-free learning. It's called The Complete Story of Africa, 16th-20th Century, a kid's history book. And it breaks down these complex events into age-appropriate stories that help children understand this important history. You'll find the link in the description below. It's perfect for bedtime reading or classroom use. Here's a truth that's uncomfortable but necessary. Not all Africans resisted. Some African leaders chose collaboration. They saw the Europeans as unstoppable and decided survival meant cooperation. They became intermediaries, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, recruiting workers. Some genuinely believed they were protecting their people by working within the system. Others simply wanted power and wealth. The British called this indirect rule. They let African chiefs stay in charge on paper while pulling the strings from behind. It was cheaper and easier than direct administration, but it created deep divisions. Communities split. Those who worked with colonizers were seen as traitors. Those who resisted were punished. And after independence, these divisions didn't disappear. They became the roots of ethnic conflicts that still plague some African nations today. This isn't about judging the choices people made under impossible circumstances. It's about understanding that colonialism didn't just divide Africa geographically, it divided communities, families, and identities. 1914, the world went to war, and Africa was dragged into it. Over 2 million Africans served in World War I, fighting for the very nations that colonized them. They dug trenches in France. They carried supplies through jungles. They fought and died defending empires that didn't consider them human. They were promised freedom, equality, and respect in return. They got nothing. When the war ended in 1918, European powers gathered again, this time in Paris, to redraw the world. Germany's African colonies were taken and handed to Britain, France, and Belgium. African soldiers who survived the war returned home to find nothing had changed. But something had shifted. African soldiers had seen the world. They'd seen Europeans bleed. They'd seen the so-called superior race beg for their lives in the mud. They came home with new ideas. If we can fight and die for them, why can't we govern ourselves? The seeds of independence were planted. Here's the part they don't teach in schools. Africa didn't wait for Europe to grant independence. Africans fought for it through protests, strikes, rebellions, and political movements. In 1919, Egyptians launched a revolution against British rule. Thousands took to the streets, demanding independence. Britain tried to crush the uprising, but the pressure was too great. In 1922, Egypt gained nominal independence. Britain still controlled the military and the Suez Canal, but it was a start. In West Africa, labor strikes paralyzed colonial economies. In 1945, railway workers in French West Africa went on strike, demanding better pay and treatment. The strike lasted months and crippled the colonial administration. France had to negotiate. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion terrified British settlers. From 1952 to 1960, Kenyan fighters launched guerrilla attacks against colonial forces. The British responded with brutal crackdowns, detention camps, and torture. But the rebellion made it clear, Kenyans would rather die fighting than live as subjects. And across the continent, intellectuals and activists were organizing. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. These weren't foreign-educated puppets, these were African visionaries who demanded self-rule. Nkrumah said it best, "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility." 1957. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to win independence. Kwame Nkrumah stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands and declared, "At long last, the battle has ended. Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." It was a spark. Over the next decade, nation after nation won independence. Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, and on and on. By 1975, most of Africa was free. But freedom came with challenges. Colonial powers left behind borders that made no sense. They left economies designed to extract resources, not to develop nations. They left ethnic divisions that had been weaponized for control. And in some cases, they left behind leaders who were more interested in power than in serving their people. The story of post-colonial Africa is complicated, full of triumphs and tragedies, progress and setbacks. But that's a story for another time. So what do we learn from all this? First, Africa was never empty. It was never backward. It was never waiting to be saved. Second, resistance is powerful. From the Zulu at Isandlwana to the Ethiopians at Adwa to the Mau Mau in Kenya, Africans fought, resisted, and refused to disappear. Third, colonialism's effects don't end when the colonizers leave. The borders, the languages, the economies, the divisions, they remain. Healing takes time, generations even. But here's the hope. Africa is still writing its story. Today, African nations are leading in technology, music, film, and innovation. Nollywood is one of the largest film industries in the world. African tech hubs are creating solutions that the rest of the world is copying. African musicians are topping global charts. African writers are winning Nobel Prizes. The continent that was supposed to be erased is thriving. And young Africans, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, are reclaiming their history, their languages, their cultures. They're asking questions, they're demanding answers. They're refusing to accept the stories they were told. If you have kids or teach children, I've also written a kid-friendly version of this story designed for screen-free learning. You'll find the link in the description. In 1884, 14 men sat in a room and tried to divide Africa. They drew their lines. They made their claims. They believed they had won. But Africa is still here. Its people are still here. Its cultures are still here. Its strength is still here. You can't carve up a continent and expect it to forget. You can't enslave a people and expect them to forgive quietly. You can't steal a history and expect the next generation not to dig it back up. This is the story. They didn't want you to know the story of kingdoms that ruled, warriors who fought, cultures that survived, and a continent that refused to die. Africa's story isn't over. And remember, if you have kids or teach children, that kid-friendly version of this story I mentioned earlier is designed specifically for young minds. The Complete Story of Africa, 16th, 20th century, a kid's history book, makes this complex history accessible and age-appropriate. Links in the description. It's just beginning.